I felt fear for the first time fighting alongside humanity. Part 2. The Vryn came 46 hours earlier than expected. They dropped out of hyperspace in staggered waves, their ships appearing on the sensor displays like dark stains spreading across clean water. There were more of them than the projections had predicted. Valeth counted 63 warships in the first wave alone, a mix of fast attack corvettes, heavy cruisers, and troop carriers that moved in a loose swarm, designed to overwhelm defensive formations. Valeth responded the way he always did. He issued orders in a flat, calm voice. He adjusted the crescent formation to account for the enemy's angle of approach. He redirected power to forward shields, and ordered all gun batteries to prepare for sustained fire. Around him, his Kelvari crew moved with mechanical precision. Every officer in the right place at the right time. Every system activated in the correct sequence. It was how the Kelvari fought. Clean, controlled, predictable. Then the Vryn did something that was not in any of the projections. A cluster of small, fast-moving objects broke away from the main Vryn formation and shot toward the edge of the corridor. Valeth's tactical officer identified them as boarding pods, dozens of them, and their trajectory pointed them directly at the civilian relay station on the outer rim of the defensive zone. The station was a communications hub staffed by about 400 technicians, engineers, and their families. It had minimal defenses, a few light turrets meant for debris clearance. Nothing that could stop a Vryn boarding party. Valeth processed the situation in seconds. The relay station had low strategic value. Diverting ships to defend it would weaken the main formation. The logical response was to let it fall and focus on holding the corridor. He began, composing the order to abandon the station to its fate. He never finished it. Nathan Cole's voice came over the fleet channel, sharp and fast. All human ships, break pattern. Gallant Fury is moving to intercept those boarding pods. Harding and Bellow, you're on escort. Marine shuttles, launch now. I want boots on that station before the Vryn get through the doors. Valeth opened a direct channel to Cole's ship. Captain Cole, you are breaking formation. This action compromises the defensive line. There was a brief pause. Then Cole's voice came back, steady and simple. There are kids on that station, Commander. Valeth did not know how to respond to that. It was not a tactical argument. It was not a strategic justification. It was a statement of fact that to the humans apparently outweighed every calculation Valeth could produce. He closed the channel and watched the human ships pull away from the crescent, engines burning bright as they raced toward the relay station. The Gallant Fury moved fast for a ship its size. Its escort frigates, the Harding and the Bellow, flanked it on either side, their guns already firing at the leading edge of the boarding pod cluster. The Marine shuttles launched from the Gallant Fury's belly in a tight formation, 6 of them, each carrying a squad of armored soldiers. Lieutenant Commander Denise Marsh was coordinating everything from the Combat Information Center aboard the Gallant Fury. Her voice on the tactical channel was calm, precise, and relentless. She directed ships and squads the way a conductor directs an orchestra, except this orchestra was playing with plasma cannons and breach charges. The first Marine shuttle reached the relay station just as the Vryn boarding pods began cutting through the hull. Sergeant Kyle Pratt was the first human through the airlock. He went in fast, rifle up, shouting orders to his squad in short, clipped sentences that left no room for hesitation. Behind him came 12 Marines who moved with the kind of coordination that only comes from training together so long that words become unnecessary. The Vryn shock troops were already inside. They were tall, armored creatures with 4 arms and black eyes that reflected no light. They fought in silence, which made them terrifying in close quarters. Every corridor became a death trap. Every doorway was a potential ambush. Pratt's squad pushed through the first deck in 6 minutes. They cleared room after room, moving civilians behind them as they went. Pratt found a group of children huddled in a storage closet, guarded by a maintenance worker who had armed himself with nothing but a heavy wrench. Pratt put his hand on the man's shoulder and said, "You did good. We got it from here." Then he moved on. On the second deck, the fighting got worse. The Vryn had set up a defensive position in the main corridor, using overturned equipment as barricades. Corporal Amy Bassett was hit by a plasma bolt that burned through her left arm from wrist to shoulder. The pain must have been incredible. Any Kelvari soldier would have fallen back to seek medical attention. Bassett did not fall back. She pressed herself against the wall, switched her rifle to her right hand, and kept firing. She held that position for 4 minutes, until Pratt's team found a side corridor and flanked the Vryn barricade from behind. When it was over, 318 civilians were evacuated from the station. 9 human Marines were dead. Valith watched the Marine shuttles return to the Gallant Fury on his sensor display. He watched the tiny blips of light cross the dark space between the station and the carrier. 9 dead. He noted their names, their ranks, their ages. The youngest was 22, a private named Danny Harmon, who had been on his first deployment. He expected the humans to process this loss quickly and move on. That was what professionals did. Instead, something happened that Valith had never witnessed before. As the surviving Marines walked through the Gallant Fury's hangar bay, they began calling out names. Not their own names, the names of the dead. One Marine would say a name, and the others would repeat it. Then another name, and again the repetition. 9 names spoken 9 times each, echoing through the metal corridors of a warship that still smelled like smoke and blood. It was not an official ceremony. No officer had ordered it. No regulation required it. It was something the humans simply did, as naturally as breathing. They carried their dead with them, not as weight, but as witness. Every name spoken was a promise that the person behind it would not be forgotten. Every repetition was an act of defiance against the emptiness that death leaves behind. Valith listened to the names through the comms intercept. He listened to every one of them. He did not know why he could not stop listening. He did not know why the sound of those names, spoken by tired, hurt, grieving voices, stayed in his mind long after the transmission ended. He added an entry to his personal file on humanity. He wrote, "Irrational bravery," and then stared at the words for a long time. They were not enough. They did not capture what he had seen. The humans had broken formation, risked their ships, and lost 9 of their own to save people they had never met. People who would never know their names. It was inefficient. It was reckless. It was, by every Kelvari standard, wrong. And Valith could not find a single calculation that made that feel like the wrong outcome. He closed the file and returned to his tactical display. The main Vryn fleet was still out there, regrouping for another push. The battle for the Atheron corridor was far from over. But something had shifted inside Valith, so small that he almost did not notice it. A crack in the wall he had spent his entire life building. He did not name it. He was not ready for that yet. But it was there, and it was growing. I felt fear, for the first time, fighting alongside humanity. Part 3. 3 days passed. 3 days of silence from the Vryn, which was worse than any attack. Silence meant they were gathering strength. Silence meant that whatever came next would be bigger than what came before. Valith used the time to repair his ships, redistribute ammunition, and run fresh projections on the corridor's defense. The numbers were not encouraging. The first engagement had cost them ammunition and hull integrity that they could not easily replace. Concord reinforcements were still 9 days out. If the Vryn returned in greater numbers, the crescent formation would not hold. On the morning of the 4th day, the Vryn answered the silence. They dropped out of hyperspace with a fleet nearly 3 times the size of the first wave. But it was not the numbers that made Valith pause. It was the ship at the center of the formation. The Korath's Fang, a Vryn dreadnought nearly twice the mass of anything in the combined fleet. It was a mountain of black metal and red light, bristling with weapons that could tear through capital ships like paper. Valith had read reports about dreadnoughts of this class. Every report ended the same way. The defenders lost. He called a joint command meeting aboard the Sereth Vaughn within the hour. The holographic display showed the enemy fleet in stark red against the blue of the corridor. Valith presented the situation without softening it. The dreadnought alone outgunned their entire formation. A strategic withdrawal to the secondary defensive line would preserve most of their remaining ships. It was the correct choice, the logical choice, the Kelvari choice. Nathan Cole sat at the far end of the table, arms crossed, staring at the display. Denise Marsh was beside him, pulling up a secondary holographic image of the nearby moon, Atheron 7. It was a dead rock, no atmosphere worth mentioning, covered in abandoned mining tunnels from a company that had gone bankrupt decades ago. Nobody had set foot on it in years. Cole leaned forward. "What if we don't run?" The room went quiet. Even the Kelvari officers, trained to suppress all reaction, seemed to stiffen slightly. Cole laid out a plan that Valith could only describe as insane. The combined fleet would pretend to retreat, pulling back slowly enough to draw the Vryn deeper into the corridor. Meanwhile, a ground team would land on Atheron 7 and set up a network of signal amplifiers using salvaged parts from damaged ships. These amplifiers would broadcast an energy signature designed to mimic a full Concorde carrier group hiding behind the moon. When the Vryn detected what they thought was a second fleet, they would be forced to split their forces to deal with both threats. That would leave the dreadnought exposed. At that moment, the real fleet would reverse course and hit the Korath's Fang from two sides in a pincer strike. Valith ran the numbers in his head. The plan had a success rate of roughly 31%, and that was being generous. There were 100 things that could go wrong. The Vryn might not take the bait. The signal amplifiers might fail. The timing might be off by even a few minutes, and the entire fleet would be caught in the open with no formation and no cover. He said this plainly. The probability of success is unacceptably low. Cole nodded. He did not argue with the math. 31% is better than 0, Commander, and 0 is what we get if we keep backing up until there's nowhere left to go. Marsh added, without looking up from her datapad, "We've pulled off worse." There was something in the way she said it. Not bravado, not recklessness. It was the quiet confidence of someone who had been through the impossible before, and had come out the other side, not because of luck, but because she had refused to accept any other outcome. Kyle Pratt volunteered for the ground team before anyone could ask. He stood up from his seat against the wall, where he had been listening in silence, and simply said, "I'll take my platoon down. We'll get it done." Valith assigned Sub-Commander Ryan and a Kelvari technical squad to support the ground operation. Ryan accepted the order with his usual composure, but Valith noticed something in his officer's eyes that he had never seen before. It was not reluctance. It was something closer to anticipation. The ground team launched that evening. 2 shuttles dropped through the thin haze of Atheron 7's dead atmosphere and landed in the dust near the entrance to the old mining tunnels. The conditions on the surface were terrible. The temperature was far below freezing. Dust storms rolled across the landscape in thick brown waves that cut visibility to almost nothing. The mining tunnels were unstable, and the equipment they had brought was heavy and unreliable. Pratt's Marines hauled the signal amplifiers through the tunnels on their backs. They dragged power cables through rubble. They welded mounting brackets to frozen rock with hands that shook from the cold. The work was brutal, and there was no glory in it. Just effort, pain, and the slow progress of 23 people trying to build something out of nothing. and they sang. Not war songs, not marching chants. A private named Hannah Doyle started it. She had a clear, soft voice, and she sang old songs that her grandmother had taught her back on Earth. Songs about rivers and fields, and people who had lived and died long before anyone had looked up at the stars. The other Marines joined in when they knew the words, and hummed along when they did not. Sub-Commander Rian later told Valith that the singing had no tactical value whatsoever, but that somehow, in the freezing dark of those tunnels, it had made the work feel possible. Back in orbit, the feigned retreat began. Valith executed it with precision, pulling his ships back in slow, measured steps, making every movement look like a fleet that had lost its nerve. The Vryn advanced to fill the space, the Korath's fang pushing forward like a predator that smelled wounded prey. Then the signal amplifiers on Atheron 7 powered up. On every Vryn sensor screen, a full Concord carrier group appeared to be hiding in the moon's shadow. It was a ghost, a trick of light and energy, but it was convincing enough to force a decision. The Vryn commander split his fleet. Half continued forward. The other half, including a dozen heavy cruisers, broke off to engage the phantom threat. Cole gave the order. All ships, hard about. Hit them now. The pincer strike was violent and fast and ugly. There was nothing elegant about it. Cole's frigates came in from the left, hammering the dreadnought's engine section with everything they had. Valith's battlecruisers closed from the right, pouring fire into the weapon arrays along the Korath's Fang's dorsal ridge. The space between the two formations became a storm of plasma, metal, and light. The gallant Fury took a direct hit along its port side that tore open 3 decks. Fire erupted on Deck 9, filling the corridors with smoke and heat. Denise Marsh was in the Combat Information Center when the lights went out. She grabbed a fire extinguisher with one hand and a wounded technician named Greg Alden with the other. She put out the fire closest to the door, dragged Alden over her shoulder, and carried him through 200 meters of smoke-filled hallway to the medical bay. Then she walked back to the Combat Information Center, sat down at her console, and resumed coordinating fleet fire patterns as if nothing had happened. The Korath's Fang fought back hard. Its weapons carved burning lines across the hulls of 3 Kelvari cruisers. But with its fleet divided and its engines damaged, it could not maneuver. Cole's frigates circled it like wolves around a wounded animal, striking at every exposed system. Valith's ships maintained disciplined broadsides from the opposite side, trapping the dreadnought in a crossfire it could not escape. It took 47 minutes. The Korath's Fang went dark. Its remaining escorts scattered and ran. In the silence that followed, Valith stood on the observation deck of the Sarath Vaughn and looked out at the wreckage. Twisted metal floated in the void. Emergency lights blinked on crippled ships. 47 people across the combined fleet were dead. By Concord standards, it was a costly engagement. By human standards, Cole said quietly over the command channel, everyone who could walk away did. Valith stood there for a long time. He stared at the debris and the distant stars, and he felt something shift inside him again. It was not the crack from before. It was wider now, deeper. He was beginning to realize that his entire understanding of war, built over 4 decades of service, was incomplete. He had always believed that war was mathematics, that the right answer was always the one with the best numbers. The humans had just won a battle with 31% odds, because they had something the numbers could not measure. He did not know what to call it yet, but he could feel it pulling at the edges of everything he thought he knew. I felt fear, for the first time, fighting alongside humanity. Part 4. The days after the battle were quiet in the way that a house is quiet after a funeral. The ships were still there. The crews were still working. But something heavy hung over everything. A weight that Valith could not see but could feel pressing against the walls of every corridor. and the silence of every room. The combined fleet had survived, but it was wounded. Half the ships in the formation were running on backup systems. Ammunition stores were low. Medical bays were full. The crews worked around the clock to patch holes, reroute power, and keep their ships alive long enough for the reinforcements that were still days away. Valith's Kelvari crew handled the repairs with their usual quiet efficiency. They did not complain. They did not talk about what they had seen. They processed the damage reports, prioritized the repair schedules, and moved on to the next task. It was how the Kelvari had always done things: clean, orderly, and empty of anything that could not be measured. The humans handled it differently. Valith began to watch them more closely during those quiet days, not as a commander evaluating an allied force, not as an intelligence officer collecting data. He watched them because he could not stop himself. There was something about the way they moved through grief that fascinated him and frightened him in equal measure. Nathan Cole visited the wounded every single morning before his shift began. He did not send a message or a recorded statement. He walked to the medical bay himself, pulled up a chair beside each bed, and sat there. He asked them about their homes. He asked about their families. He asked what they wanted to do when the war was over. One morning, Valith monitored the internal comms and heard Cole speaking with a wounded pilot named Chris Garner. Garner had lost the use of both legs during the battle when a bulkhead collapsed on his lower body. He would never fly again. He was 28 years old. Cole sat with him for over an hour. Valith could not hear everything they said, but he heard enough. Cole did not offer empty promises. He did not tell Garner that everything would be fine. He told him that what had happened was terrible, and that it was all right to be angry about it. And then, somehow, he made Garner laugh. Valith heard the sound through the comms, a real, full laugh from a man who had every reason in the universe to never laugh again, and it stopped him cold. He did not understand how laughter could exist in the same space as loss. He did not understand how a man who had lost his legs could find anything worth laughing about. But the sound was real, and it carried a warmth that made the cold metal walls of the Sereth Vaughn feel, for just a moment, like something other than a machine. Valith also began to notice what Denise Marsh did during her off-duty hours. She did not rest. She did not sleep, as far as Valith could tell. She sat in her quarters and wrote, not tactical reports, not operational assessments. She was compiling a document that listed every human who had died since the campaign began. Their names, their ranks, their ages, where they were from, what they liked, who they loved. Valith found himself standing outside her open door one evening. She looked up at him. Her eyes were red, and her face showed the kind of exhaustion that sleep alone could not fix. "Can I help you, Commander?" she asked. Valith hesitated. It was the first time in his life he had ever hesitated before speaking. "What are you writing, Lieutenant Commander?" She looked at the datapad in her hands. A record of who they were. High Command will receive the casualty reports. Their names are already documented. Marsh shook her head. Casualty reports list how they died. This lists how they lived. She paused and then added quietly, "Someone should remember who they were, not just that they stopped being." Valith did not respond. He stood there for a moment, nodded once, and walked away. But her words followed him down the corridor like footsteps. Kyle Pratt had started spending his free time in the training bay, but not for his own training. He was teaching hand-to-hand combat techniques to some of the younger Kelvari soldiers who had never seen close-quarters fighting before the relay station assault. His methods were nothing like Kelvari training. He did not lecture. He did not follow a structured program. He sparred with them, made mistakes on purpose so they could learn to exploit openings, and talked the entire time. He told jokes. He gave encouragement freely and loudly. When a young Kelvari ensign named Toreth landed a solid hit on him during a sparring session, Pratt grinned through a split lip and said, "There you go. That's the stuff." Toreth later sought out Valith privately. The young ensign seemed unsettled, though he struggled to explain why. "The human sergeant said something to me," Toreth said carefully. "He said that I fight well, but that I need to learn to fight for something, not just because someone ordered me to. I do not fully understand what he meant." Valith told Toreth that the humans had different values and that he should not concern himself with it. But even as he said the words, he knew they were hollow. He was beginning to understand exactly what Pratt had meant, and the understanding was uncomfortable. It was Sub-Commander Ryan who finally forced Valith to confront what was happening inside him. Ryan requested a private meeting. This was unusual. Ryan had served under Valith for 15 years, and had never once requested a meeting outside the normal command schedule. He arrived at Valith's quarters precisely on time, stood at attention, and then did something even more unusual. He sat down without being asked, as though the weight of what he was carrying was too heavy to hold while standing. He told Valith about the ground mission on Atheron Wave, not the tactical details. Those were already in the official report. He told him about the moments in between. He told him about dragging equipment through dust storms so thick he could not see his own hands. He told him about the cold that seeped through their suits and into their bones. He told him about the moment when the third signal amplifier failed, and they had to rebuild it from scrapped components in the dark. And he told him about the moment he had wanted to quit. "I calculated the probability of success," Ryan said, his voice flat, but his eyes betraying something raw underneath. "It was less than 15% with the equipment failures. I was prepared to recommend aborting the mission." "What stopped you?" Valith asked. Ryan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "The human girl, Private Doyle, the one who sings. She was covered in dust. Her hands were bleeding from the cold. The amplifier she was working on had shorted out for the second time, and she looked at me through the dust, and she said, 'We are not leaving until this is done, not because of orders, because those people up there are counting on us.'" Ryan looked at Valith directly. "I have served the Concorde for 40 years. No one has ever said anything like that to me. I have followed orders because orders are orders. I have never once considered that there could be another reason to fight." Valith did not speak for a long time after Ryan left. He sat alone in the dim light of his quarters. He did not review tactical data. He did not run projections or study enemy fleet movements. For the first time in his career, he simply sat with himself. He thought about Cole sitting with a legless pilot and making him laugh. He thought about Marsh writing down the lives of the dead so someone would remember them as people and not numbers. He thought about Pratt teaching young Kelvari to fight for something they believed in. He thought about Hannah Doyle, bleeding and freezing, refusing to leave because people she would never meet were counting on her. And he realized what he was feeling. It was not confusion. It was not a malfunction in his emotional suppression. It was fear. Not fear of the enemy, not fear of death. It was a deeper, stranger fear. The fear of a man who has spent 40 years believing he understood the world, only to discover that he had been reading the map upside down. He was afraid because the humans had shown him something he could not unsee. They did not fight despite their fear. They fought because of it. Their fear was not a weakness to be suppressed. It was the very thing that gave their courage meaning. A Kelvari who felt nothing could follow any order, but a human who felt everything and still chose to stand and fight was something else entirely, something that Valith did not have a word for in his language. He sat in the dark for a long time, and for the first time in 40 years, he did not know what to do with what he was feeling. So he did the most human thing he had ever done. I felt fear for the first time, fighting alongside humanity. Part 5. Concorde reinforcements, never came. The 9 days passed. Then the 10th day came, and with it, a coded transmission from High Command that Valeth read 3 times before he fully accepted what it said. The Concord Relief Fleet had been rerouted. A second Vryn armada had appeared out of nowhere and struck the Harith homeworld, one of the founding species of the Concord. Every available ship had been pulled to defend it. The Atheron corridor was being officially abandoned. All forces were ordered to fall back to the inner defensive perimeter immediately. Valeth read the order one more time. Then he walked to the Joint Command Center aboard the Sereth Vaughn, where Nathan Cole and Denise Marsh were reviewing damage reports. He set the datapad on the table in front of Cole and said nothing. Cole read it. His face did not change, not at first. He set the datapad down gently, as though it were made of glass, and looked at Marsh. She read it over his shoulder. Neither of them spoke for several long seconds. The only sound in the room was the low hum of the ship's engines and the faint crackle of a loose wire somewhere behind a wall panel. Then Cole said, very quietly, "There are 3 colony worlds behind us in this corridor, roughly 2 million people." Valeth confirmed the number. He also confirmed what the numbers told him. Holding the corridor without reinforcements was not possible. The fleet was operating at 60% combat effectiveness. Ammunition was critically low. Several ships could not achieve full speed. If the Vryn returned with anything close to their previous numbers, the combined fleet would be destroyed. He presented this information clearly and without emotion, because that was what he had been trained to do for 40 years. He laid out the facts, showed the projections, and concluded that withdrawal was the only option that preserved fighting strength for future engagements. It was the right answer, the logical answer, the answer that every Calvari officer in the history of the Concord would have given. Cole stood up. He was not a tall man by human standards, but in that moment he seemed to fill the room in a way that had nothing to do with physical size. He looked at Valeth directly, his brown eyes steady, and he spoke in a voice that was not loud, not angry, not desperate, just certain. "Commander, I am not going to tell you what to do with your ships. That is your decision to make. But I want you to know that the Gallat Fury and every human ship in this corridor are staying. We are not going anywhere." Marsh nodded beside him. "We're not leaving those people behind." Valeth asked the question that his training required him to ask. "On what tactical basis do you make this decision?" Cole paused. Then he said simply, "Because it is the right thing to do." Valeth looked at him for a long moment. Then he turned and walked back to the Sereth Vaughn. He stood on his command deck. The viewport stretched out before him, showing the vast dark of the corridor and the cold light of distant stars. Behind those stars, invisible but real, were 3 colony worlds. 2 million people who had no idea that a fleet of battered ships was all that stood between them and annihilation. He thought about his career. 40 years of perfect service. Every order followed, every protocol observed, every decision made by the numbers. He thought about his file on humanity, the one he had started with the words cultural inefficiency, and that now contained observations he could not explain or dismiss. He thought about Hannah Doyle singing in a dust storm because the people above her were counting on her. He thought about Amy Bassett holding a corridor with one working arm because the civilians behind her had nowhere else to go. He thought about Kyle Pratt teaching a young Calvari ensign that fighting means nothing if you do not know what you are fighting for. He thought about Denise Marsh writing down the names of the dead so they would be remembered as people who lived, not just people who stopped living. He thought about Nathan Cole sitting beside a broken pilot and giving him back the one thing no medical bay could provide, the feeling that someone cared. He opened a fleet-wide channel. Every Calvari ship under his command heard his voice. "This is Commander Valith Sorath. I have received orders from High Command to withdraw from the Atheron corridor. I am choosing not to comply." The silence on the channel was absolute. "There are 2 million civilians behind us, and our allies have chosen to stay. I am asking each of you to make your own choice. I will not compel anyone to remain. But I will tell you this. I have fought alongside humanity for 16 days. In that time, I have learned something that 40 years of service never taught me. War is not an equation. It is a promise. A promise that someone will stand between the darkness and the people who cannot stand for themselves. Today, I intend to keep that promise. Those of you who wish to withdraw may do so without penalty. Those of you who wish to stay, form on my wing." Every Calvari ship stayed. The Vrin came the next morning. They came hard and fast and without mercy. A full assault fleet, with 3 heavy cruiser groups, and enough firepower to burn through the corridor twice over. There was no trick this time. No feint. No clever strategy. There was only the line and the decision to hold it. The battle lasted 11 hours. The Gallant Fury lost its port engine array in the first wave. Fire ripped through its lower decks. Cole ordered the crew to seal the burning sections and keep fighting. He stood on his bridge as the ship shook around him, giving orders with the same calm drawl he had used in the very first briefing. Valith's flagship, the Sereth Von, took a direct hit to its forward compartments that killed 37 of his crew in an instant. Valith felt the ship shudder beneath him. He felt the loss register somewhere deep inside him, not as a number on a casualty report, but as a wound. He kept fighting. Kyle Pratt led a boarding counter-assault against a Vrin cruiser that had latched on to one of the Calvari frigates. His squad was a mix of humans and Calvari, fighting side by side through the dark corridors of an enemy ship. Pratt and Ensign Torith fought back-to-back in a corridor so narrow they could reach out and touch both walls. When a Vrin soldier charged them, Torith put it down with the exact move Pratt had taught him in the training bay. Pratt grinned through the blood on his face and said, "Told you that would come in handy." Denise Marsh coordinated fleet movements from a combat information center that was half on fire. A section of the ceiling had collapsed. Sparks rained down from broken conduits. She rerouted power from damaged systems, adjusted formations to cover gaps left by crippled ships, and directed fire with a voice that never wavered. Not once. In the 8th hour of the battle, the Gallant Fury's main batteries went offline. The ship was dying. Its armor was breached in a dozen places. Its power core was failing. Any sane commander would have ordered an evacuation. Cole did not order an evacuation. He ordered the Gallant Fury to move forward. He aimed the crippled bow of his ship directly at a Vrin destroyer that was bearing down on a damaged Calvari medical ship. The Gallant Fury rammed the destroyer at full speed, driving its broken hull into the enemy vessel's flank and pushing it away from the medical ship. The collision tore the Gallant Fury apart from the nose back to the second bulkhead. 17 crew members died on impact. But the medical ship survived, and the 300 wounded aboard it lived. The line held. When the Vrin finally broke and fled, the corridor was filled with wreckage and silence. The combined fleet was shattered. Ships drifted without power. Emergency lights blinked in the darkness like dying stars. Cole's ship was venting atmosphere from 6 decks. Valith's flagship had lost a third of its crew. But behind them, untouched and unharmed, 3 colony worlds kept spinning. 2 million people went about their lives, most of them never knowing how close they had come to the end. In the days that followed, rescue ships and repair vessels arrived from the inner perimeter. The wounded were evacuated. The dead were counted. The surviving ships were towed to dry dock for repairs that would take months. Valith sat in his quarters aboard the battered Sereth Von. He opened a blank file and began writing his after-action report. He stared at the empty screen for a long time. Then he began. I have served the Galactic Concord for 40 standard years. In that time, I have never deviated from doctrine, never questioned an order, and never experienced what other species call emotion. I considered these things strengths. I now understand they were limitations. During the defense of the Atheron Corridor, I fought alongside humanity for the first time. They are loud, inefficient, sentimental, and reckless. They mourn their dead as though each loss is a wound that never fully heals. They laugh in the face of impossible odds. They sing in dust storms. They write letters they may never send. They carry every name, every face, every life they have touched into battle with them like armor that no weapon can pierce. I have studied war my entire life. But I did not understand it until I stood beside them. I felt fear for the first time fighting alongside humanity. Not because they frightened me, but because they taught me what it means to have something worth being afraid to lose. He submitted the report without changing a single word. 3 months later, the Galactic Concord held a formal vote to upgrade humanity's status from provisional member to full strategic partner. Representatives from all 12 species were present. The debate lasted less than an hour. The vote was unanimous. Commander Valeth Sorath cast the Calvari vote personally. He stood at the podium in the great hall of the Concord Assembly, a vast chamber of light and stone, where the fate of civilizations had been decided for 6,000 years. He wore his full dress uniform. His face showed nothing, because he was still Calvari, and some things do not change overnight. But when a Concord journalist asked him afterward why he had voted to give humanity full partnership, he paused. He looked out the window of the assembly hall at the stars, the same stars he had looked at from the observation deck of the Sereth Vaughn, and he gave an answer that was reprinted on every newsfeed across the Concord within the hour. Because they stayed. He walked away without another word. But somewhere in the pocket of his uniform, folded carefully, was a piece of paper. It was a letter that Kyle Pratt had given him after the battle, one of the letters the Marines wrote before deployments. Pratt had told him, "You should read this when you get a chance. It is not classified or anything. I just think you would understand it now." The letter was short. It was addressed to Pratt's younger sister back on Earth. It said, "Hey Maggie, if you are reading this, I probably did something dumb and brave, which I know you always told me not to do. I am sorry. But I need you to know that I was not scared. Okay, that is a lie. I was always scared, every single time. But I kept going because there are people out here who need someone to stand up for them. And I decided a long time ago that I would rather be scared and standing than safe and sitting down. I love you. Tell Mom I love her too. And do not let Dad sell my truck." Valeth had read the letter 4 times. Each time he understood it a little more. And each time the fear he had discovered inside himself grew a little quieter. Not because it went away, but because he was learning to carry it the way the humans did. Not as a weakness, but as proof that he had finally found something worth protecting. I felt fear for the first time, fighting alongside humanity. Part 1. Commander Valeth Sorath had served the Galactic Concord for 40 standard years. In all that time, he had never once raised his voice. He had never smiled. He had never felt his chest tighten with worry or his hands shake with anger. He was Calvari, and the Calvari did not do such things. They were a species built on logic, discipline, and silence. Emotions were considered a defect among his people, something that lesser species indulged in because they lacked the mental architecture to suppress them. Valeth had always taken pride in this. He was a perfect soldier, cold, precise, and unbreakable. So when High Command informed him that a human detachment would be joining his battle group in the Atheron corridor, he simply read the orders, noted the details, and began preparing the Sereth Vaughn, his flagship, for the arrival of his new allies. The Atheron corridor was a long stretch of open space between the inner colonies and the frontier. For months, the Vryn Dominion had been pushing into Concord territory, burning through border outposts, and swallowing entire systems with a hunger that seemed to have no end. The Vryn were not like the Concord species. They did not negotiate. They did not take prisoners. They came, they consumed, and they moved on. 2 full Concord fleets had already fallen to them, and now High Command was pulling together every available ship to form a defensive line. That included the humans. Valeth had read the files on humanity. They were a young species, barely 300 years into space travel. Their ships were crude by Concord standards, built with thick armor and heavy weapons instead of the elegant shielding systems that older species preferred. Their military doctrine was considered reckless. Where the Kelvari would calculate, the humans would charge. Where the Concord would withdraw to preserve strength, the humans would dig in and refuse to move. Intelligence analysts had described them as emotionally volatile and tactically unpredictable. Valeth had filed this information away and expected very little. The human carrier USS Gallant Fury arrived at the rendezvous point on a Tuesday morning by Earth's calendar. Valeth watched it come through the viewport of his command deck. The ship was ugly. There was no other word for it. It was a blocky, angular thing, covered in welded armor plates and bristling with gun turrets that looked like they had been bolted on as an afterthought. It moved through space with the grace of a falling rock, but it moved with confidence, and even Valeth had to admit that there was something solid about it. It looked like a ship that had been hit many times and had never stopped flying. Captain Nathan Cole came aboard the Sereth Vaughn for the first joint briefing an hour later. He was a tall man with a square jaw, dark skin, and calm brown eyes that seemed to take in everything without rushing. He walked with a slow, easy stride, as if he had all the time in the world, even though they were preparing for a war that could end all of them. Behind him came his executive officer, Lieutenant Commander Denise Marsh, a lean woman with red hair pulled back tight, and a face that looked like it had been carved for giving orders. She carried a datapad under one arm, and a coffee cup in the other hand. Valeth had never seen anyone bring a beverage to a war briefing before. Behind them came a small group of human officers and Marines. They filled the hallway outside the war room with noise. One of them, a young sergeant named Kyle Pratt, was bouncing a small rubber ball against the wall and catching it while he waited. Another, a corporal named Amy Bassett, was telling a story that made 3 others laugh so hard that one of them had to lean against the bulkhead. Valeth's Kelvari officers watched this with expressions that, on any other species, might have been called disbelief. Sub-Commander Rian, Valeth's most trusted officer, leaned close and said quietly, "Are we certain these are soldiers?" Valeth did not answer. He led the humans into the war room and activated the holographic display showing the Atheron corridor and the projected Vryn advance. He explained the plan in clear, measured terms. The combined fleet would hold a crescent formation across the corridor's narrowest point. Overlapping fields of fire would create a kill zone. The fleet would absorb the Vryn's initial attack, hold position, and wait for Concord reinforcements that were expected in approximately 12 days. Casualties were projected at 14% if everything went according to plan. It was a clean, logical strategy. Nathan Cole listened without interrupting. He nodded in the right places. He studied the holographic map with the focus of a man who had seen many maps like it. When Valeth finished, there was a brief silence. Then Cole leaned forward. "And if we see a chance to hit them back?" Valeth blinked. It was the closest thing to surprise his face could show. "The operational mandate is defensive, Captain. Offensive action is not authorized." Cole nodded slowly, as if he had expected that answer. He did not argue. He just smiled, a small, quiet smile that did not reach his eyes, but seemed to say more than any words could. Denise Marsh made a note on her datapad without looking up. She took a sip of her coffee. The briefing ended. The humans filed out, still talking, still making noise. Kyle Pratt picked up his rubber ball from where he had left it outside and started bouncing it again. Amy Bassett resumed her story at the exact point where she had paused it. That night, Valith sat alone in his quarters and reviewed the human crew manifests. He read through their service records, their training histories, their personal files. He noticed something that struck him as peculiar. Many of the human Marines had a tradition of writing letters to their families before a deployment. Handwritten letters, sealed in envelopes, left behind in their bunks with instructions for delivery in case they did not return. He considered this for a long time. If they survived the campaign, the letters would never be sent. They would be thrown away or tucked into drawers and forgotten. If they died, the letters would arrive at homes where people already knew the worst had happened. The letters would change nothing. They would not bring anyone back. They would not undo the loss. They were, by every logical measure, a waste of time and energy. Valith wrote a note in his personal log. He labeled the observation cultural inefficiency and closed the file. He did not yet understand what those letters meant. He did not yet understand that the humans were not writing to change anything. They were writing because love does not obey logic, and because some things need to be said, even if no one is left to hear them. He did not understand any of this yet, but he would. The Vryn were coming, and they were bringing something far worse than weapons. They were bringing the kind of darkness that forces every living thing to decide what it truly believes in. Valith did not know it, but his education was about to begin.